So welcome to this webinar focusing on developing your voice of reason. I'm Linda Elder. I'm the president of the Foundation for Critical Thinking. I'm delighted you're joining us, and I'm delighted to see both new faces and returning faces. And I'm delighted that you're continuing to burrow in for those of you who are coming back. And for those of you who are new, this will maybe feel a little overwhelming, but you'll begin to get a sense of how you can view the voice of reason from the point of view of the tools of critical thinking fundamentally. And so what I'd like to do in this webinar is something new, and that is have you do a little work this time. And that means I'm going to ask you to write a little bit, think a little bit, and then I'm also going to ask you to go into breakout rooms and share just a bit to process as we go through this webinar. And that's important in learning anything, really. But if you're developing a voice of reason, you're going beyond the, okay, I get the theory. The theory sounds good. The question is, so what do you do with the theory to develop your voice of reason? So now it's important at the outset to realize that there are many, many ways to articulate a voice of reason. And we need not articulate a voice of reason through the explicit tools of critical thinking. But if we are cultivating a voice of reason, whatever tools we're using will have to result in certain phenomena existing in your mind. So one is your voice of reason is self-disciplined. So that means that you are using some tools to discipline your mind. And for some people, this is going to come more naturally than to other people. And some people are going to have, we're all going to have blind spots. So your blind spot may not be my blind spot. So, but in any case, I'm going to have to discipline my mind in order to create a voice of reason. I'm also going to have to be self-determined and self-guided. So you don't create a voice of reason in someone else. If there is a voice of reason that's been created by you, it's the one that you created in your own mind. So right now, I can't say that I'm creating the voice of reason in you. If it were, let's say if it even were to work, right? If you were to achieve that over, let's say, the next year, I can't then say that I created that voice, because that wouldn't be true. What would be true is that you created it using tools that you learned somewhere that you didn't have before. And we can learn those tools in many ways. The explicit toolbox of critical thinking, of course, gives us many entries in, which we'll be discussing. But first, I want you to get the bigger picture of how I would articulate the voice of reason. So it's self-disciplined, it's self-guided. And if you think about if you're teaching, then that means that you are hoping to cultivate within the student a voice of reason. And your question then becomes, how do I do this? Because this is now my purpose. And then if I'm exhibiting a voice of reason, then I'm adhering to universal intellectual standards. And we'll burrow into these, but to give you a sense of this for those of you who are new. So in intellectual standards, universal intellectual standards are standards that we all apply to reasoning when we're reasoning at a high level. We may be doing this and usually are doing this more at the unconscious level or the non-explicit level. And these include clarity, accuracy, relevance, depth, breadth, logicalness. So in other words, take the concept of clarity. Whenever you reason with anyone, you are trying to be clear. You may not realize that that's what you're trying to do, but you are trying to do that. And so we are automatically adhering to these intellectual standards to some degree, but then the question is, how do we adhere to them more systematically? So you come to tonight with a somewhat developed voice of reason. The question is, how do you improve that voice that you've been trying to improve, or you wouldn't be here? So we're going to be self-disciplined, self-determined, adhering to intellectual standards, and we also must be attempting to embody universal intellectual virtues. And intellectual virtues are character traits that the critical thinker attempts to embody. So for example, intellectual autonomy, the propensity to think for yourself using the tools of criticality. Intellectual courage, the courage to look at your own beliefs. You can't develop your voice of reason if you cannot examine the beliefs within your mind. And intellectual perseverance. That means we are willing to persevere through difficulties in whatever it is we're focusing on, whatever we're trying to reason our way through. So these are intellectual character traits that are embodied through a voice of reason. So that is a beginning place for thinking about this voice. Now, notice the concept of voice of reason. Voice is an analogy, right? We're not talking about the brain here. We're talking about the story you tell yourself. Notice that's a different analogy from the voice of reason. So there are many ways to create these analogies that help us improve our thinking. And creating an inner voice of reason is, I think, a very powerful analogy. Now, by way of just a starting place for our thinking, or for your thinking about your own voice in terms of its reasonability, let's pause for a minute. And I want you to ask yourself, what is the voice that you engage in your mind throughout the day, as a general rule? What do you tell yourself as you go through your day? So some people tell themselves, I have to find people who will validate me. If I don't find people who will validate me, I won't be able to live. I won't be able to stand it. So you see how poisonous that voice is? And that's not the voice of reason. Now, humans all need social interaction, and we'll come back to that, social connection. But we have to know when it is rational and when it is not rational. to engage in that connection or those connections. So what, here's another way to think about this. So you engage in typical patterns of thinking as you move through the day. So let's say on a typical day, you get up in the morning and what do you start thinking? That's what I want to know. What do you then think after that? What do you think when you're on your way to work? What do you think when you are at work? What are your patterns of thought? What happens as you come home? What happens when you walk in the door when you arrive at home? What is your current voice telling you? And I don't want you to tell me. I want you to tell yourself. And I'd like you to write down your answer to this. And throughout this hour, we may share after you do some homework, but you will not be asked to share anything that you do not feel comfortable sharing. So you might just share something that you learned, not necessarily your exact example. So we don't need to hear your examples. And the reason that's important is because if you're opening up your voice of reason, you may be seeing things that you really do not want to share with someone else. Why would you need to share it if you can learn from it yourself? You see, you don't have to share everything. So if I told you were going to be sharing it, you see, there would be a sense of, okay, I'm going to be, be really careful what I write down. So right now, I want you to just think about this voice. What is this voice telling you? Is it hounding you? Is it dogging you? Is it telling you you're not good enough? Is it telling you you can't succeed? What is it telling you? Is it telling you to boss other people around? Is it telling you to control other people? Is it telling you that you are the center of the universe and everything you do is right? What is it telling you? So now I'm going to pause for a minute for you to just think about that. What is your current voice throughout the day? Hello. All right, now we are not going to discuss this right now. I just was warning you that we might. But what this will do, this little bit of thinking that you've done will help you with your thinking about where you are right now. And it's a sort of baseline as you move forward. So you should be able to come back to this and later on and say, that's really interesting. Look, I was doing those things and those were fine, but then look at all the things I was able to add after that. So now let's move forward into the theory of critical thinking a bit. And then I'm going to circle back to the point that there are many ways to articulate a voice of reason. So notice I'm trying not to say the voice of reason, because there isn't one voice. It depends on the situation. If this is we're dealing with a debatable issue, then there's not the voice. There are multiple voices, some of them better and some of them worse than others. So a voice of reason is a reasonable inner voice that is focused on basically making sure that the thinking that you're doing is good enough before you move forward. So it's the executive voice that we're trying to develop. Again, many ways, there are many ways of saying this. So now let's look at this. You can see my screen, right? You can see a circle, I hope. And in this circle, you see most of the primary concepts in our approach, although there are others. This is the starting place. I've already mentioned some of this. So we're ultimately hoping in critical thinking to cultivate intellectual character, traits of mind, intellectual autonomy, again, intellectual integrity, intellectual humility. And we need tools for assessing thinking, and we need tools for analyzing thinking. Why? Because whenever we think through certain elements of reasoning. So these are all tools, or really each of them is a toolbox for developing your voice of reason. But we also have to be aware of the barriers to critical thinking that we can place under the rough categories of egocentric and sociocentric thinking. So we'll talk just briefly about each one of these in connection to creating this voice of reason. So now let's just look, we can burrow in anywhere here, but I'm going to start with intellectual standards. And by the way, I'm working from the miniature guide to critical thinking concepts and tools, which you can read about on our website and purchase from our publisher if you like. This gives you an overview to our approach. So if we're focusing in on intellectual standards, now remember I mentioned clarity, accuracy, relevance. Well, here are a few more. So precision, depth, breadth, logicalness, significance, fairness, and sufficiency. And these come from a much larger set of hundreds or more extant in any ordinary language. So what we've done is we've pulled what we consider to be essential intellectual standards, and this intellectual standards guide unpacks this much more, but these we consider essential. Why? Because we need to use these on a routine basis, and all of us need to, as humans, we need to make sure that whenever we say anything, we're clear. If you're saying things and it's all gobbledygook, then you're not going to be able to communicate. We need to make sure that what we say is true. Obviously, we have a big problem with this today because people are saying things that make no sense, that have no basis in reality, and they're presenting them as true. And now we have, misinformation and disinformation. And so accuracy is an important intellectual standard. And precision means we need more details. The situation determines the level of detail that we need to consider. Relevance means we're keeping our thinking on track. This is essential to the voice of reason. If you cannot keep your thinking on track, then your thinking is going to be chaotic. It's going to be all over the place, and you're not going to be able to develop this voice of reason. Depth means we need to consider complexities. Why? Because the question requires us to. Breadth means we need to consider more than one point of view. Why? Because the question at issue tells us that we have to. It points out the points of view that we have to consider. We need to make sure that our thinking is logical. Does this conclusion logically follow from the evidence that you're presenting to me? And then significance. Is this an important question? Is this an important problem? Fairness. Are we looking at all of these points of view in good faith? And sufficiency. Do we have enough information to answer the question? Or are we distorting some information, leaving something out that we don't want the people to see, so to speak? So notice I gave a couple of questions, or a few questions as I went through this for each one of these intellectual standards. Every one of these questions represents a powerful intellectual move that is made by any voice of reason, and every voice of reason. So in other words, you've got to have these concepts working in your thinking to be creating a reasonable voice, because your reasonability isn't itself an intellectual standard. Reasonability, justifiability, these are additional intellectual standards. So notice that each of these questions then represents an intellectual move that can be practiced. And herein lies another piece of this. If you want to develop your voice of reason, you have to practice your voice of reason. It's not going to just happen, right? Just went to a webinar, it was great, got some questions, now they're in my mind. No. You were introduced to something, it looked like it made a lot of sense, let's hope, and then you either are practicing using those tools, or they're fading a bit and becoming just sort of interesting theory that you could talk about to someone. To see the difference? So if you're internalizing an idea, it is transforming you. So that now let's just take clarity, something very simple. Could you elaborate further? Could you give me an example? Could you illustrate what you mean? I can very frequently in any discussion with anyone, I do clarify. Let me see if I understand what you just said. Let me clarify. Is it all right if I clarify? Is it all right if I tell you what I think you just said? You can tell me if I'm accurate. Notice there are two intellectual standards I just used. So, but I can't make that move if the voice in my mind is not telling me to make that move. And that's the voice we're trying to cultivate. So how do we learn these? We practice them. And you can take one standard per week and just put these questions up on your refrigerator and just see if you are, to what degree are you adhering to these? And if it seems that like it's super easy, nothing could be easier, this is so Mickey Mouse, then let's see if you're doing it. Do you see? And I say that not facetiously, but to help you see that these tools are really so easy, they're hard, right? So you could say, well, clarity, gosh, of course, clarity, yeah. But then start noticing how often we violate clarity in daily life, even when we have a theory of critical thinking, you see? So I mean to include myself in this as part of the problem. In other words, we all have to continually be working on these. Like, let's say if you wanted to learn to play an instrument, you will have to be playing that instrument and practicing that instrument quite often if you're going to be good at it, right? Same is true with critical thinking. The question is, how do you create that practice for yourself? That's the challenge. So I've given you one strategy. Take one of these standards per week with the questions. And at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day and the end of the day, look up there at the questions and just ask yourself, am I incorporating that standard into my voice? And have I violated that today? For example, let's say, I mean, as an example, someone may waste a lot of time on the superficial and not focus on the significant. So that at the end of the day, when they think about what they did and they've got significance on the refrigerator, then they'll be able to see, well, I did nothing but superficial things today. And then you might say, well, maybe that's what you needed to do, because every other day you're doing significant things. So sometimes we need to relax and do the, let's say, insignificant. So that's, again, now this shows you that suddenly this is not going to be easy because it's going to be an art, not a science. So you could say, how do you, one of the concepts that I use in my thinking, which I've mentioned, is the concept of sublime space. So creating sublime space within your mind. And that would be a place where you go where it's always pleasant and where you are thinking positive thoughts. You are maybe also doing something. You could be listening to music. You could be playing the piano in any way you can. You could be playing tennis. You could be doing art. You could be playing with your child, your grandchild. The question is, where is your sublime space? Not where is someone else's, but where is yours? And this is essential, by the way, to mental health. So mental health depends upon having a voice of reason. Because if you don't have a minimal voice of reason, you're going to be persecuting yourself, going to be beating yourself up. You're going to be, again, dumping on yourself in all kinds of ways. So any of those things are going to get in the way of that voice of reason. All right, so I've given you one strategy. So at the end of this, when I ask you, what is one strategy that you learned, you will at least be able to say, you can put each standard up with the questions for a week, and then you can email us and tell us how that worked. Post that in the community online. That would be good to see. Now, I want to move from that backwards a bit, and then we'll go forward into the more theory of critical thinking. So now I just barely introduced you to universal intellectual standards, but I've also said, remember that there are many ways to articulate a voice of reason. And I'm frequently in my readings in classics, I'm looking for that voice of reason. I'm continually looking for examples of that voice of reason articulated through the ages in different ways. Often it's a dissenting voice. But now here is one example that I want to share with you. This is an excerpt or a few excerpts from the book that is now titled The Idea of a University, although you can still get it in its older version, Discourses on the Scope and Nature of University Education, written in 1851 by John Henry Newman, who was a Catholic, and he wrote on Catholicism, and he also wrote on education. And what I want to show you is his example as a voice of reason. Now, I'm not commenting on his religious views. I'm commenting on the processes he's articulating here. So let me give you an example of what I mean here to connect this to critical thinking. So he begins, or this excerpt begins with truth. You can still see my screen, right? Truth of whatever kind is the proper object of the intellect. Stop there. Voice of reason. Truth of whatever kind is the proper object of the intellect. Truth is connected to one of the intellectual standards, at least, right? Which one?
Accuracy.
Thank you. Accuracy. Is it true? Is it correct? So he comes out with right away with this excerpt, truth of whatever kind is the proper object of the intellect. Its cultivation then lies in fitting it to apprehend and contemplate truth. So here he's saying the cultivation of the intellect, which is really what he's talking about throughout this section of the book, which is about the first half of the book. Its cultivation lies in fitting it to apprehend. In other words, helping it figure out how to find out if something is true. I'm trying to say it in other words, right? To bring it into my thinking. Again, this is an example of the voice of reason. I know that if I'm going to bring this into my thinking, I have to say it in my own words. I have to make sure I understand what he's saying. And I have to hook on something I'm already thinking. So truth of whatever kind is the proper object of the intellect. Its cultivation lies in fitting it to apprehend and contemplate truth. The intellect in its present state does not discern truth intuitively or as a whole. So in other words, what he means is by our very nature, we don't necessarily know whether something is true, just by our nature. We don't automatically know this. We know not by a direct and simple vision, not at a glance, but as it were by piecemeal and accumulation, by a mental process, by going round an object, by the comparison, the combination, the mutual correction, the continual adaptation of many partial notions, by the employment, concentration, and joint action of many faculties and exercises of mind. Now, say that in your own words. See how eloquently he is cultivating this, what this voice of reason looks like, what reasonability looks like. Now, I want you to, I'm going to break you into groups for a few minutes since I said I was. And I just want you to now pick up where I left off. And I didn't explain anything that I just said. Explain what that means in your own words. What does that mean to you? How does that help you? How would you say that today? And then go on to take each sentence, just go around the group, and each of you take one sentence and just say in your own words what you think it means. And the others of you say, yes, I think that's right, or no, I don't think that's correct. And just try to stay focused on the text, not anything else that you want to talk about, just the text. And the question is, how does this help you understand the cultivation of the intellect? So let's do this for a few minutes, and then so let's see if I can do this. Just for a few minutes, process this. You won't have time to get through much of this. I'm going to share this in your rooms. I think you must have enjoyed the breakout rooms because I noticed you stayed until the very end. So that's a positive. Noticed you didn't have much time, and I was really hoping for you to just get a sense of what I'm talking about here, in that the voice, our voice of reason can be articulated in many ways. I want to just read a couple of lines from The Last Days of Socrates by Plato. And these are just other examples of ways to think about a voice of reason as articulated by Socrates as we hear from Plato. Serious thinkers, and this is from Crito, serious thinkers, I believe, have always held some such view as the one which I mentioned just now, that some of the opinions which people entertain should be respected and others should not. See the move? He's not using one of the intellectual standards, but he's implying them, and he's actually, Socrates was groping toward them and does articulate numerous standards. Now, he says, now I ask you, don't you think that this is a sound principle? You are safe from the prospect of dying tomorrow in all human probability, and you're not likely to have your judgment upset by this impending calamity. This is when he was on trial for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the day. He says, consider then, don't you think that this is a sound enough principle that one should not regard all the opinions that people hold, but only some and not others? What do you say? Isn't that a fair statement? And you see, it's not quite as precise as the intellectual standards, but he's moving in that direction. And he was certainly looking for theory of criticality. And he was calling it that. He didn't need to, yes. And fair-mindedness is an essential part. This is coming from the chat, thank you. Fair-mindedness is an essential part of Socrates' point of view, perspective, and worldview, just as it is in our perspective. So fair-minded critical thinking. And he upheld the ethical dimension. He was constantly helping people see that they were not really thinking in that direction. And one final quote from this is from the Apology. If you haven't read it, you must read it. And this is the very last paragraph. After he's been condemned to die, he says, when my sons grow up, gentlemen, if you think that they're putting money or anything else before goodness, take your revenge by plaguing them as I plagued you. And if they fancy themselves for no reason, you must scold them, just as I scolded you, for neglecting the important things and thinking that they are good for something when they are good for nothing. If you do this, I shall have had justice at your hands, both I, myself, and my children. So do you see the example here? He's using the concept of importance. He's bringing in the concept of goodness, of fair-mindedness, and he's bringing in this idea of disciplining, right? Disciplining the mind. You behave towards them the way I behaved towards you, and I'll be satisfied. So it is that voice that we're looking for. And again, you can find it throughout the classics, not everywhere, not every classic author is as good as every other one on this point, but you can be on the lookout for those links. Now, very briefly, let me point out some other theory that you can and should be using ultimately as you develop your voice of reason. Now, going back to our original diagram overview of the Paul Elder framework for critical thinking, you see here we focused a little bit on the assessment of thought, only intellectual standards. It's the only theory we've really focused on, except I've mentioned the others. Now, let's burrow into the cultivation of intellectual virtues. Why? Because what we really want in what we need in human life is we need people who are embracing and embodying these intellectual virtues. So, and now all of us are to some degree embodying these. And maybe in certain areas of your life, you're embodying them significantly, like say confidence and reason. Let's say in your work, you're very good at following the facts wherever they take you. But maybe you're not so good at following the facts wherever they take you in your personal life. Maybe there are things in your personal life you'd rather just not face. And those are the very things that you should face. If you're going to create this voice of reason, you can't be hiding from yourself. You can't hide from things that are painful for you to face. So whatever you're thinking right now, that's the thing you need to think more about. Don't let yourself get away from that. So we need, if we're embodying these, we're embodying these across the domains of our life, not just in one domain. We have plenty of people who are thinking critically within one domain. That's the norm to the degree that we see critical thinking, right? So we see the highly skilled engineer, we see the highly skilled scientists in all kinds of different facets, the highly skilled medical doctor. But what we need to know is first, how do we help everyone become the highly skilled person in their field? And second, how do we bring those tools that we're using in one part of our life to the other parts? That's called integrating your thoughts. It's directly connected to intellectual integrity. So in other words, let's again go back to your life. If each of us were able to come into your life and we could sit on your shoulder and we saw everything that you did all throughout your life, every day, would we come out of that study saying that you're a person of integrity? Do you say one thing and do something else? Do you behave at work in one way, in a different way at home? So, for example, take the example of the psychiatrist who is helping people at work become better in their intimate relationships and in their family relationships, and then that person goes home and abuses their family. What is that? How is that possible? It's called compartmentalization. So a person of integrity does not compartmentalize. So a person of integrity would not mind us being on their shoulder. They wouldn't mind it because they just say, well, this, if you want to see how I am, I'm like this all the time. So you can follow me around. You can listen to all my discussions with everyone I ever talk to, but this is what you're going to see this every time. Then that's, at least we know what we're dealing with, right? By the way, D.H. Lawrence was really sort of into that, right? You know, just let it all hang out. Like, just make sure that we know who you are. I think he and others could go a little too far there, but that was part of what was behind his thinking. So stop hiding and start showing who you really are. So these are just some ways into thinking about intellectual virtues. Now, but we can burrow in to any one of these with specific questions that will help us develop this voice of reason. Again, this is coming from the miniature guide, and these are pages 24 and 25. Imagine a world where everybody took these kinds of questions seriously. Now, I'm focusing on here on intellectual humility. And this means that we can distinguish between what we know and what we do not know. And we're not afraid to say, I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not afraid to say, well, I misspoke a few minutes ago. I was misremembering something. Or I realized I didn't have all the information I needed. Somebody gave me more information. Now I see it differently. You see, that's a person who can be moved by reason. So, but a key part of this is your ability to distinguish between what you know and what you do not know. And one way to think about that is to think about how there is, like, if you could imagine all of the knowledge in the world fitting into the square that is your face, that your face is in, your square. If that were all the knowledge in the world, how much of that do you think you really know? Virtually nothing. In other words, if you think about all the information that's available, all the knowledge that you could have, how much do you actually have? It's very, very small in comparison to what's out there. So mostly we teach in college, teach people how to be arrogant about their body of knowledge, not to have intellectual humility. So imagine a world where we were thinking through these kinds of questions that you see here that will help us develop intellectual humility. What do I really know? What do I really know, period? But what do I really know about myself? See, I'm pulling from these questions here. What do I really know about myself? What do I really know about this situation right now? What do I really know about this other person? What do I really know about my nation, about my government, about anyone at all? What do I really know about my own spouse? What do I really know about my own children? What do I really know? You see, what do you really know? And then to what extent do my prejudices or biases influence my thinking? What if you just thought about that question throughout the day? Let's see, to what extent are my biases or prejudices influencing my thinking right now? You see how you'd have to just focus on that and just be intensely focused on just that question? Because it's sort of a hard way. It's hard to figure out your biases and prejudices because they're driving you to a large extent. I mean, they're in your assumption base. So this is one way in. To what extent have I been indoctrinated into beliefs that may be false? Well, you can't really answer that in toto. You have to answer that in piecemeal. Remember John Henry Newman, piecemeal? So you'd have to say, well, let's see, let me think about all of the groups that have influenced me in my life. Of course, this would be impossible to do, but you could give it a try. So you could say, well, I was born into a religious family and I was taught to believe the following things. And then you could say, have I really examined those beliefs? Or I was taught the following beliefs in school or by my family or whatever groups you belong to. You see, we are thrust into worlds of ideologies. We're not born into a blank slate that we can control. We're born into a lot of belief systems. And this happens the minute you're born. And your family, your parents, of course, immediately start putting their ideas into you. And you can't think critically in the beginning because you don't have the developed capacities. Now, some people earlier on are able to start to see through things than other people. But the question is, what are these beliefs that you're carrying around that you have not examined? So see how we're almost out of time and we just have started. So we begin to open up what this voice of reason would look like. This is on intellectual humility. Now, intellectual courage. To what extent have I analyzed the beliefs I hold? That's related to the last question. So now we begin to see interrelationships between intellectual virtues. And to what extent am I willing to stand up against the majority, even though people might ridicule me? And that's related also to intellectual autonomy. Then intellectual empathy. Wait a minute. Yeah, that was the one that we don't have the questions for. That was an error. Intellectual autonomy. To what extent am I a conformist? This is a very important one. Put that question up on your refrigerator and ask yourself throughout the day until you no longer need to what extent am I conforming? Whenever it doesn't make any sense to be conforming. It's not in my interest to be conforming. So these are, I'm not sure what happened there. These are some questions we can ask focused on intellectual virtues. So you can burrow into that set of concepts. And then we haven't talked about the elements of reasoning, and I'm just going to just briefly mention a couple of other things here. And so we need to focus on analyzing thinking. We need to be developing intellectual virtues, and we also need to understand what is involved in our thinking when we reason. So whenever we reason, these parts are present, and note every one of these parts represents a concept that we can then use to help develop our voice of reason. So if I understand that whenever I reason, I have a purpose, I'm asking a question, at least one. I'm using information. I'm interpreting. I'm making inferences based on the information and based on my assumptions. And I'm beginning with concepts, which are connected with my point of view, all of which leads to implications. So if I understand this, then I can make moves like this. Now, here is another way of looking at the elements of reasoning. So if I understand whenever I reason, I have a purpose, I can say, well, what is my purpose right now? So, for example, whenever I was preparing this webinar, I was asking myself, what is my purpose? And I kept going back to that. And what is reasonable to expect in this brief time? And taking the information that I know some of the people will be new and some will be returning. How do I take that into account? You see? So you're making these moves, and we're doing this unconsciously. But again, the more conscious we are, the better our thinking will be on average, so to speak. In other words, you can always think well as a one-off. That's what people tend to do. We're asking how do we do this systematically? So here are some questions we can ask, and there are many other questions we can ask. here is a broader checklist for reasoning. If all reasoning has a purpose, then I can question not only my purposes, but anyone else's. Can you tell me what your purpose is? What is the objective of your reasoning? Is your reasoning staying focused throughout this process? And so forth. You see, you can notice every one of these questions represents an intellectual move that we want to work into our thinking to create this inner voice of reason. So you can come back to the elements of reasoning. And if you have access to our community online, if you're a member, you can read in the library. You can read excerpts from the Critical Thinking Concepts and Tools Guide, the Analytic Reasoning Guide, Human Mind. You can watch the videos and do the activities in the Academy. So those activities are there for your practice. And it is through the practice that you develop this voice of reason. I say that once, I say that again, I say it ad nauseum. And so notice I can go over the theory. Remember, I was focused on intellectual humility, intellectual autonomy. I would just talk a little bit about the theory, but as soon as you see the questions force you to make a move. The questions force you to take the theory and not just run your eyes across it and say, yes, it sounds good. I'm sure I'm doing that. Right. So now, very briefly, in this Human Mind Guide, we focus on the relationship between thinking, feeling, and desires. And I'm working now from this Thinker's Guide to the Human Mind. And again, you see much of this is in the community online, but this is the entire guide. So here's one powerful idea for developing voice of reason. Whenever you reason, whenever you think about the mind, realize that you're always thinking, you're always feeling something, and you're also always desiring something, or you're not desiring. And this is a triangle of processes that are continually occurring. So before you came here, you had some ideas of what might be happening, and you had some thinking, you did some thinking about it. You didn't just land here, right? You didn't just, well, guess I'm in a Zoom meeting, but by the foundation, I don't know what I'm doing here. No, you thought, and based on your thinking, you were motivated to come tonight or today, wherever you are. And so you thought something, you wanted something, and you were probably feeling something like anticipation, and you're looking forward to it. Hopefully, maybe if you're new, you were not sure, but you had some feeling state. And now that we are at the end, the same thing is happening. The same process is occurring, but you can be having different thoughts. You see, you can have different, you may be thinking differently than you were before. You may have now further desires to continue learning. You may be feeling, hey, this is something, this is exciting because I can do this, and this will help me. That's one possibility. What I'm wanting you to mainly see is that you've got the thinking, you've got the feeling, and you've got the desires, and those are there throughout the day. We've been focusing on thinking mainly. So now here is a strategy that you can use to help you develop this voice of reason. Whenever you feel any negative thought, ask yourself, what is the thinking that's leading to that? Any feeling that is unpleasant, uncomfortable, I don't like this, I don't like what's going on here, that feeling, stop and ask yourself, what am I thinking right now that is causing this or leading to this or is connected to this? And you could say, well, somebody is yelling at me and I'm feeling angry, so there's nothing about my thinking that's the problem. The problem is that other person's behavior. Well, I would say, well, your thinking is involved, because your thinking is telling you either to stay in that situation when you may have the option to leave. Somebody's yelling at you, then why are you in such a situation? How did you get into that? Is this something you can even control? And don't tell me that you can't control it when you can control it. You see, that's the disciplined voice of reason. That's me telling myself. Do you see the move I made? So it's like telling myself, don't tell me that. Don't tell me that I can't do something when I can. And so I'll give you a really quick personal example. So I had something happen which was very disappointing, and it had to do with buying a small lot where I live. And I missed this opportunity, and I wanted to preserve it for the animals. And I felt very strongly about this. And I was very upset. I was just really distraught. And I kept telling myself, because it was sold when I was out of town, and I kept kicking myself for that, for missing that, for getting that wrong, for not being on that. And finally, I kept saying to myself, Linda, you've got to let this go. You've got to let this go. And I was kept on it, but I shouldn't have. Finally, I kept saying to myself, because it kept coming back, this irrational voice. Finally, I said, okay, I think I figured it out. I figured out that I'm not allowed. I said this out loud. You figured out, Linda, that you're not allowed to make mistakes. You're not allowed to make any mistakes. You are Superwoman. Everyone else can make mistakes, and you can tell them it's a good thing to make mistakes, but you yourself know. You are going to win every game you play. Do you see? Right? So that was going on, and I had to keep working it and working until finally I had to say it out loud. And as soon as I said, you're not allowed to make mistakes, then I laughed. And I was on the road to, as it were, recovery, because and so I had to keep moving into that. I keep reminding myself, okay, yeah, Linda, yeah, you're normal. You're a human. Okay, so so you notice that you don't necessarily have to say, okay, is that clarifying? Is that accurate? Is that, ask yourself, what is happening right now and how can you improve upon it? And you will be in the realm of critical thinking if you're accurate. You don't have to know exactly the move that you're making in terms of the theory of critical thinking. You just have to make the move. And it is not a voice that's beating me up. It's the opposite of that. It's a voice that's saying, get off of me. Stop telling me I have to be perfect. Just quit that. So this is a voice that is, so wherever you're nagging yourself, wherever you're harassing yourself, and then then you need to intervene. And the easy move is, well, that's caused by, like my upbringing, my childhood. Well, here we are now, and your parents presumably have no control now, and you have to be in control of your voice of reason. And so let me wrap this up by just pointing out one other thing that I haven't pointed out, which you want to burrow into. For those of you who are not, this is your first time with our work, you want to become familiar with the problem of egocentric thinking and the problem of sociocentric thinking. And these are manifest in many different ways, and you can document them yourselves. I'm looking at the right-hand side of this diagram. The egocentric side is the selfish side, and the side that is locked into this point of view. That was the example I was given of me being egocentric, locked into the point of view that I'm perfect. You see, that's not logical. So when I apply the standard of logic to it, then I realize it's not the right move. It's not the voice of reason. So self-validating means you're locked into this point of view. It's a narrow point of view. You keep telling yourself why you're correct, and you can give all yourself these reasons, but actually there's something you're missing. And then the parallel to this is where we're going along with the crowd, where we're being selfish in our group, or we're just validating one another. And you can think of many examples of this that happen at your work, in your life, in many ways. It's throughout human life, you'll see this occurring. And these barriers to your voice of reason, developing that voice, are largely unconscious in your mind. That's why I said I had to say it out loud finally. And you see, the ugly irrational voice can't stand the light of day. Remember that. So if you actually make yourself say out loud what you think is maybe irrational, but you're not really sure, as soon as you blurt it out, there it is. You will be able to see that it's not logical, and not in every case, because you may be still just trying to deceive yourself, which is one of the things that we naturally do as humans. So self-deception plays a large role in egocentric and sociocentric thinking. What we want to do is to develop this left-hand side, the fair-minded side, the self-developing side, and the side that we have access to, the conscious side of the mind. So we've got to use this conscious side to fight against this largely unconscious side. You see, so developing the voice of reason, a voice of reason, is not just about, let me just see if I can adhere to some intellectual standards, or let me just take one little piece of the theory. No, it's also about fighting your own demons. And these barriers are very significant in theory of critical thinking, because we can teach the theory all day long, but without the barriers, without people being committed to seeing those, they're not going to develop this voice of reason in a highly cultivated way. So now it's overtime. I appreciate all of your perseverance through this. We did have one little activity. I hope that you'll continue doing activities. Remember, think about the development of the voice of reason the way you would think about developing as a tennis player or a violinist. What would you have to do? Well, then do that parallel. You'll need to read a little bit every day. You'll need to be putting those words up on your refrigerator. You'll have to come up with your own practice. There are many ways in. And when you're taking one way in, you're also connecting to the other ways. Not every single concept is related or interrelated, but they all do form a constellation. So I want to say thank you. I hope this is helpful. I'll stay for a few minutes for questions, if anyone would like to ask any questions.